When Lisa learns that her mother, a black woman, was killed by police officers because of racial prejudice, she joins her father in a dangerous fight for the truth. A system steeped in racism and corruption is willing to do anything to hide the truth. But can they break down the barriers that are built on skin color and prejudice? Subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced injustice? Dr. James Williams was no stranger to challenges. A renowned black cardiothoracic surgeon, he had spent years perfecting his craft, rising to the top of his field despite the systemic obstacles placed in his path. His surgical skill was matched only by his perseverance. Yet behind his stoic professionalism, James carried a wound that had never healed, a wound not of flesh but of the heart. Years ago, James had lost the love of his life, Monica. She had been everything to him, intelligent, beautiful, with a will of steel. They had shared a powerful connection, one built on mutual respect and admiration, something rare to find. Together, they had dreamed of a life where they could overcome any challenge, but that dream had been abruptly shattered. Monica had vanished without a trace, taking their infant daughter with her. The sudden disappearance had left James desperate and broken. He had searched everywhere, hired private investigators, scoured public records, but Monica had disappeared as if she had never existed. The questions haunted him. Why had she left? Was she safe? What had happened to their daughter? As the years passed, James buried himself in his work, building a reputation as one of the country's top heart surgeons. To the world, he appeared as a man of success and strength, but inside, he was a man grieving for a family he could no longer find. His pain was a well-kept secret, hidden behind surgical masks and spotless scrubs. This day, like so many others, began with the routine chaos of the hospital. James had just finished a challenging procedure when his pager buzzed urgently at his waist. Another critical patient. He barely had time to process the exhaustion in his body before he was needed again. It was just how things worked in a place like this. Endless needs, endless crises. The patient was a young woman named Lisa in her early 20s who had been rushed in after a horrific car accident. Her injuries were severe, but what made her case even more urgent was the discovery of a congenital heart defect that threatened to complicate her already dire situation. Without immediate intervention, she would not survive. As soon as James saw her scans, he knew he would have to operate without delay. As he scrubbed in, James felt the familiar rush of focus and clarity that came with preparing for surgery. He had seen countless critical cases over the years, but something about this one was different. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a feeling that tugged at the edges of his mind as he examined Lisa's face, unconscious and bruised from the accident. It was a face he had never seen before, but somehow it felt oddly familiar, like a memory hidden just out of reach. Shaking off the feeling, he turned his attention back to the task at hand. Lives depended on his ability to focus, and this was no time for distractions. The operation was grueling. Hours passed as James worked meticulously to repair the damage to her heart and stabilize her other injuries. His hands moved with the precision and confidence of someone who had spent decades mastering his craft. But throughout the procedure, that nagging sense of familiarity persisted. Who was she? Why did he feel so connected to this woman he had never met? Finally, the surgery was complete. James removed his gloves, exhausted but relieved. Lisa had made it through the operation, though her recovery would be long and difficult. He glanced at her one last time as she was wheeled into the ICU, her pale face peaceful in sleep, and that strange sense of recognition washed over him again. It wasn't unusual for surgeons to feel a bond with their patients after such intense procedures, but this felt deeper, more personal. Dismissing it as a byproduct of his own exhaustion, James turned his attention to the next case. But even as he worked through the rest of his day, the image of Lisa's face lingered in his mind. Over the next few days, James visited Lisa often, checking on her progress. She was still weak, but she was recovering, and soon she was awake enough to speak. Their conversations were brief at first, just the typical patient-doctor exchanges, but as she became more alert, Lisa began to open up a little about herself. She was clearly shaken by the accident and by the holes in her memory that it had caused. One afternoon, as James checked her vitals, Lisa shared something that caught his attention. "I don't remember much from before the crash," she said softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "But I remember my mother. She was everything to me." James paused, listening closely. "She died recently," Lisa continued, her gaze distant, eyes glassy with unshed tears. "It wasn't natural. It was the police. A misunderstanding, they said, but I know better." Her words cut through him like a blade. Something about the way she spoke, the resignation in her tone, the quiet strength in her eyes, it reminded him of someone. Could it be? No, it wasn't possible. Still, James couldn't shake the thought. "When did this happen?" he asked gently, trying to mask the sudden urgency in his voice. "Just a few months ago," Lisa whispered. "Her name was Monica." James froze. His heart stuttered in his chest, his blood ran cold. The name hit him like a tidal wave. It couldn't be. There were plenty of Monicas in the world. It had to be a coincidence, a cruel coincidence. "Monica?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. What was your last name?" Lisa frowned, struggling to remember. I don't know. The accident, I can't remember. I just remember her first name. Monica." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. James felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss. Could this young woman be connected to his Monica? Could this be his daughter? The thought was so outrageous that he immediately pushed it aside. Lisa was white after all. His daughter, if she were alive, would be black, like him, like Monica. This was just a tragic coincidence. There was no way this could be true, and yet the seed of doubt had been planted. As the days passed, James found himself obsessing over the possibility, turning it over in his mind. Could it be? Could this woman, whom he had saved without a second thought, be the daughter he had spent years searching for? Several more days passed, and as Lisa's strength returned, so did fragments of her memory. She remembered bits and pieces of her life with her mother, how strong she had been, how much she had sacrificed. But the more she remembered, the more she realized how much she had forgotten. It frustrated her, this inability to piece together her own past. James, meanwhile, couldn't stop thinking about her. He began making inquiries, discreetly looking into Lisa's background. The more he learned, the more unsettled he became. She had no known family, no records of a father. Her mother had died in a confrontation with the police, shot under questionable circumstances. The details of her case were murky, and any attempts to investigate further were met with resistance. The more James learned, the more he began to believe the impossible. The connections were too many, the timing too perfect. But how could it be? How could his daughter be sitting in front of him and he not have known? The thought tormented him. Every time he looked at Lisa, he saw Monica's eyes, her expressions. But the facts didn't add up. His daughter would look different, wouldn't she? He needed answers. But first, he needed proof. The tension in Dr. James Williams' mind only grew as the days passed. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that there was more to Lisa's story, more than just a chance resemblance. Every time he saw her, that sense of familiarity deepened, and the doubts he'd tried to push aside crept closer to the surface. It wasn't just the name, Monica, but her expressions, her mannerisms, her voice. They stirred memories buried deep within him, memories of a woman he had loved so fiercely and lost so tragically. Yet there was one glaring problem he couldn't ignore. Lisa was white. How could she be his daughter if Monica was black? He turned this question over in his mind endlessly, and no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the doubt remained. The timeline fit, the circumstances matched, but that one fact, Lisa's appearance, made the connection seem impossible. One afternoon, after another of his visits to check on Lisa's recovery, James returned to his office, his mind swirling with uncertainty. He couldn't continue this way, questioning without answers. He needed more information. If Lisa really was Monica's daughter, then there would be something, a record, a birth certificate, something that could confirm or dispel this growing suspicion. He began to make calls, carefully and quietly. The hospital had access to certain databases, and James knew how to navigate them discreetly. He reached out to contacts who might be able to pull information on Lisa's family background, but the results were frustratingly limited. Official records on her were sparse, almost non-existent, which only deepened the mystery. Her mother's death at the hands of the police was also difficult to investigate. The file had been classified as an unfortunate incident, and any further digging was met with resistance from the authorities. James felt a familiar sense of anger bubbling inside him. He had seen this before. Cases where the deaths of black individuals at the hands of the police were quietly swept under the rug, investigations stalled, and justice denied. It enraged him that Monica, if this was truly her, had suffered the same fate. And now her daughter was lost, adrift, without even the memory of who she really was. He needed to know the truth. He couldn't rest until he did. A few days later, as he continued his investigation, James made a breakthrough. A colleague in the hospital administration had managed to pull an archived photo from old hospital records, one that had somehow escaped deletion. It was a photograph of Monica, holding a small baby girl in her arms. James felt his breath catch in his throat as he stared at the image. The baby. She was white. It was a shocking revelation, one that he hadn't anticipated. He had always assumed that their daughter would look like him, a mix of his and Monica's features, but this child had inherited the genetic traits that gave her lighter skin. The reality of it hit him like a tidal wave. It was possible. It was entirely possible that Lisa was his daughter. James sat down heavily, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. He had spent years wondering, questioning, searching, and now the answer had been right in front of him all along. Lisa, this young woman he had saved on the operating table, was his daughter. But how could he tell her? How could he even approach her with something like this when she herself had no memory of her own family? And what if he was wrong? Despite the photo, despite the timeline, there was still a chance that he was mistaken. He couldn't afford to act impulsively. He needed to be sure. He needed more proof. While James wrestled with his newfound discovery, Lisa was experiencing her own struggles. Her memory was still patchy, and the more she tried to recall, the more it seemed to slip away. But there were moments, fleeting, painful moments, when glimpses of her past surfaced. They were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror, but they were there. One afternoon, as she lay in her hospital bed, she closed her eyes and tried to focus on the fragments she had. Her mother's face came into view, strong, determined, but always worried. There had been something that her mother had been running from, something that had kept them on the move. Lisa had never questioned it when she was younger, but now she wished she had. And then there was the accident. She could remember the moments leading up to it, the sound of tires screeching, the sudden impact, but the details were still murky. What had they been running from? What had her mother been so afraid of? A nurse entered the room and handed Lisa a small box of personal belongings that had been found with her after the accident. Lisa opened it carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside, there were a few scattered items: her phone, some jewelry, and an old notebook that had belonged to her mother. As Lisa opened the notebook, her breath caught in her throat. On the first page, in her mother's familiar handwriting, was a note. It was addressed to her. "My dearest Lisa, there is so much I need to tell you, but I fear I won't have the chance. You must know that everything I did was to protect you. Your father, he loved you more than anything. He searched for us, but I had to keep you safe. I'm sorry. One day you'll understand. His name is James. James Williams." Lisa's hands shook as she read the words. Her father's name, James Williams. She knew that name. The man who had saved her, the man who had been visiting her every day. Her doctor. Was it possible? Could he be the father she had never known? Her heart raced, 1,000 emotions crashing over her at once. Confusion, anger, fear, and something else. A glimmer of hope. Was it true? Was the man who had saved her life the same man who had been searching for her all these years? Later that day, James entered her room again, as he had so many times before. But this time, something was different. The air between them felt charged, filled with unspoken words. Lisa's eyes met his, and she could see the weight of something heavy in his expression. She didn't wait for him to speak. She couldn't. She had to know. "Dr. Williams," she began, her voice trembling, "I found something in my mother's things. A note." James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew it would come eventually. "A note?" he asked carefully, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. Lisa swallowed hard and nodded. She wrote about my father. She said his name was James Williams." There it was, the truth, hanging in the air between them. James felt the world tilt beneath him, his worst fear and greatest hope colliding in a single moment. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Lisa, I need to know the truth," Lisa interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you my father?" For a long moment, the room was silent. James could feel the weight of the question pressing down on him, and he knew there was no turning back. He had to tell her. She deserved to know. "Yes," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father." Lisa gasped, her eyes wide with shock. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. She didn't know how to process it, how to feel. "All these years," she whispered, "you were out there, and I never knew." James felt a lump rise in his throat. "I never stopped looking for you. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find you or your mother. I didn't know where you had gone." Lisa stared at him, her mind reeling. She had so many questions, so many things she didn't understand. Why had her mother kept her away from him? Why had she never told her about her father? "I don't know what to say," Lisa admitted, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything right now," James replied gently. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I'm here, and I always have been." The room was thick with emotion, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Lisa looked away, tears filling her eyes as she tried to process the weight of what she had just learned. James watched her, his heart aching for all the years they had lost, but now at least they had found each other. In the days following the revelation, an uneasy quiet settled between James and Lisa. The knowledge that they were father and daughter hung heavily in the air, but neither of them seemed ready to fully confront the reality of what that meant. Lisa was still reeling from the shock of it all, her emotions swinging wildly between anger, confusion, and a strange sense of relief. She had spent so long wondering about her past, and now that the truth was finally out, it felt both like a blessing and a burden. James, for his part, tried to give her space. He knew that this was a lot for her to process, and he didn't want to overwhelm her with the weight of his own emotions. But inside, he was filled with a mix of regret and hope. He had lost so many years with his daughter, years that he would never get back. But now that he had found her, he was determined not to lose her again. They began to talk more as the days passed, their conversations filled with cautious questions and tentative steps toward building a relationship. James told her stories about her early days, about the moments he had shared with her mother before everything fell apart. He spoke of his long search for them, the sleepless nights, the endless frustration of running into dead ends. Lisa listened in silence, absorbing each word with a kind of quiet intensity. She wanted to know more, but she was still unsure how to feel about it all. The anger she felt toward her mother for keeping this secret clashed with her sympathy for the fear that had driven Monica to do so. It wasn't long before Lisa began asking about her mother's death again. The circumstances surrounding it had always been murky, but now, knowing that her mother had been on the run, Lisa couldn't help but wonder if there had been more to the story than she had been led to believe. James, too, had his suspicions. Monica's death had been labeled as a tragic accident, the result of a misunderstanding with the police, but he knew better than to take that explanation at face value. "I need to know what really happened," Lisa said one afternoon, her voice firm with resolve. She was sitting up in bed now, her strength slowly returning, though her body still bore the marks of the accident. Her eyes, though, were sharp and determined, a reflection of her mother's fiery spirit. James nodded. He had been waiting for her to say those words, knowing that the time would come when she would want answers. He had already begun making inquiries, quietly using his connections to dig into the case, but he hadn't told Lisa yet. He wanted to be sure he had something solid before bringing her into it. "I've already started looking into it," James admitted, leaning forward in his chair beside her bed. "There's something off about the way the case was handled. Too many things don't add up." Lisa's expression hardened. "I knew it. I knew they were hiding something. My mom didn't deserve what happened to her." "No, she didn't," James agreed. His voice was tight, his anger barely contained. He had spent his entire life fighting against the systemic racism that permeated so many aspects of society. But this was personal. Monica had been taken from him, and now he knew that justice had never been served. "We'll find out the truth," Lisa said, her eyes blazing with determination. "Whatever it takes." James smiled, seeing the strength in her that had once drawn him to Monica. "We will, I promise." The investigation wasn't easy. Every door they knocked on seemed to be locked tight, and every record they requested seemed to be sealed or missing. It was clear that someone was working hard to cover up the details of Monica's death. The official story was that Monica had been mistaken for someone else during a police operation, and in the ensuing chaos, she had been shot and killed. But that explanation never sat right with James, and now it seemed that his suspicions were well-founded. Together, James and Lisa began to dig deeper. They contacted lawyers, civil rights groups, anyone who might have access to the information they needed. James used his position in the medical community to reach out to people who could help, while Lisa scoured every available source for any detail that might have been overlooked. It wasn't long before they started to uncover discrepancies in the official reports. Witnesses who had initially given statements about Monica's death had either recanted their stories or disappeared altogether. There were gaps in the timeline of the incident, and the officers involved seemed to have been reassigned or retired soon after the case was closed. It was a textbook cover-up, and the deeper they went, the clearer it became that someone with a lot of power had been involved in hiding the truth. As they pieced together the puzzle, Lisa's anger grew. She had always suspected that her mother's death wasn't as simple as the police had made it out to be. But now, faced with the overwhelming evidence of corruption and deceit, her frustration turned to fury. "They killed her," Lisa said one evening, her voice trembling with rage. "They killed her, and then they just buried the truth." James placed a hand on her shoulder, his heart aching for the pain she was feeling. "We'll get justice for her, Lisa. I won't let this go." But the fight was just beginning. As they pushed harder, making noise and demanding answers, they began to attract the attention of those who had a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden. Threats came, subtle at first, anonymous phone calls, veiled warnings from people in positions of power. It was clear that they were stirring up trouble, and the people responsible for Monica's death were determined to silence them. One evening, after a particularly long day of phone calls and meetings, James found a letter slipped under his office door. It was typed, with no signature, but the message was clear: "Drop the case, or you'll regret it." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had expected resistance, but this was a direct threat, one that was aimed not just at him, but at Lisa as well. He couldn't let her be put in danger, not after all they had already lost. When he showed the letter to Lisa, she reacted just as he had expected, furious but undeterred. "We're not stopping," she said firmly. "They think they can scare us off, but we're not going anywhere." James admired her courage, but he was also worried. These people had already killed once to protect their secrets. What was to stop them from doing it again? "Lisa, we have to be careful," James cautioned. "I don't want anything happening to you." "I'm not afraid," Lisa replied, her jaw set with determination. "They took my mother from me. I'm not going to let them get away with it." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right. Backing down wasn't an option. But the stakes were higher than ever, and the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous their quest became. The breakthrough came when they found a key witness, someone who had been there the night Monica was killed. It was a former officer, now retired and living under a different name. He had been part of the operation that led to Monica's death, and though he had stayed silent for years, guilt had finally gotten the better of him. James and Lisa met him in a rundown diner on the outskirts of the city. He was an older man now, his face lined with regret, but his eyes were sharp. He hadn't wanted to get involved again, but something about Lisa's determination had moved him. He told them everything. Monica's death hadn't been an accident. The officers had been ordered to eliminate her because she had information that could have exposed a major corruption scandal within the police force. She had been running, trying to protect herself and Lisa, but they had caught up to her. The officer who pulled the trigger had been part of the conspiracy, and the entire operation had been orchestrated to make it look like a tragic mistake. Lisa listened in silence, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury. James felt his hands clench into fists as the man recounted the details. They had killed Monica in cold blood, and then they had covered it up, hiding the truth for years. "Why now?" James asked the man. "Why tell us this after all these years?" The man sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I couldn't live with it anymore. I've seen too much, and I couldn't bear to see her daughter suffer like this." Lisa stared at him, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "They're going to pay for this," she said quietly. "All of them." With the new information, James and Lisa took their case to the media. The story exploded, and the public outrage was immediate. Protests erupted, demanding justice for Monica and all the other victims of police corruption. The officers involved were finally brought to trial, and the full extent of the corruption within the department was exposed. It was a long and difficult battle, but in the end, justice was served. The officers responsible for Monica's death were convicted, and the police force underwent a massive overhaul to root out the corruption that had festered for so long. But for James and Lisa, the victory was bittersweet. They had won justice for Monica, but it couldn't bring her back. They had lost so much, and there were still wounds that would take time to heal. As they stood outside the courthouse on the day of the final verdict, Lisa turned to James, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." James looked at her, his heart swelling with pride and love. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I'm your father. I'll always be here for you." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling around them. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of peace. They had found each other, and together they had found the truth. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an upload. And don't forget to check out our other videos for more powerful stories like this one. Which moment surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. See you in the next video.